The police officer had one hand resting on his belt and the other hovering way too close to his handcuffs when he looked at me and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step off HOA property." And I remember just staring at him for a second because I was standing in my own driveway, holding a half-drunk cup of coffee, wearing sweatpants older than some marriages. Behind him stood Cynthia Holloway with her arms crossed, and this smug little smile, like she'd been rehearsing this moment in the mirror all week. "I warned you about those solar panels, Russell," she said. "Nobody wants this neighborhood turning into a trailer park." Now, if you've never dealt with the president of a homeowners association who thinks she was personally appointed by God to protect suburban property values, let me tell you something. Those people don't argue like normal humans. They don't yell. They don't fight fair. They stand there calm as a church pianist while they slowly try to erase your existence with bylaws and fake smiles. And Cynthia Holloway had spent the last 2 years trying to erase mine. "My name's Russell Mercer. I'm 54 years old, retired electrician, bad knee, bad back, decent smoker on the weekends when my doctor ain't looking, and I've lived on the same patch of land outside Franklin Ridge, Tennessee, my entire life. My grandfather bought the property back in 1976 when the whole area was nothing but hay fields and gravel roads. Back then, nobody cared what color your mailbox was or whether your grass matched your shutters. People minded their business. You fixed your neighbor's fence if it blew down. They brought you casserole when your dog died, simple stuff. But things changed after the developers came in around 2003. They built Willow Creek Estates all around our property, big fancy entrance signs, decorative ponds, fake brick mailboxes, all that nonsense people pay extra for so they can pretend they're living in some Hallmark movie. Grandpa sold most of the acreage because the medical bills were piling up, but he kept our house and a few scattered parcels around the neighborhood. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Honestly, I barely understood half the paperwork myself. Grandpa always used to say, "Never sell every inch, Russ. Always keep something they'll need later." I thought it was old farmer talk. Turns out the old man was playing chess while everybody else was finger painting. Cynthia moved into Willow Creek in 2019 straight out of Scottsdale, Arizona, with a white Range Rover, expensive sunglasses, and the kind of confidence only people with HOA authority and no real hobbies seem to have. Within 6 months, she was on the board. Within a year, she became president. And after that, well, suddenly everybody started getting letters. One family got cited because their Christmas lights stayed up 3 days too long. Another got fined because their kid's basketball hoop was visually disruptive. Cynthia once tried to force a widow named Maria Alvarez to remove her wind chimes because they created inconsistent acoustic aesthetics. I swear to God those were her exact words. At first she mostly ignored me because technically my property wasn't part of the HOA, but people like Cynthia can't stand exceptions. The idea that somebody exists outside their control eats at them like termites in drywall. So she started small. Complaints about my workshop being an eyesore. Complaints about my truck leaking oil even though the damn thing didn't leak a drop. Then she started walking the neighborhood, taking pictures of my garden like she was building a criminal case against tomatoes. Every conversation with her felt like a performance. She'd smile while threatening you, laugh while insulting you. One afternoon she walked onto my property without asking and said, "You know, Russell, cooperation is what keeps communities civilized." I looked at her and said, "Pretty sure electricity does more for civilization than matching flower beds." She didn't like that much. Then came the solar panels. My electric bill had gotten ridiculous, and honestly, I liked the idea of cutting my dependency on the power company after 30 years of wiring houses for rich people who left every light in America turned on. The installation took 2 days. By the 3rd day, Cynthia was in my driveway holding a binder thick enough to stop bullets. "Exterior modifications require HOA architectural approval," she announced. I laughed because I genuinely thought she was joking. "Cynthia," I said, "I'm not in your HOA." Her face tightened so fast you could almost hear the Botox creak. "Everyone in Willow Creek follows community standards." "Well," I said, sipping my coffee, "that sounds like a you problem." And that right there was the moment she decided to go to war with me. 3 weeks later, I was standing in my own driveway with a police officer telling me I was trespassing, and in my back pocket sat a folded piece of paper that was about to ruin Cynthia Holloway's entire life. I didn't show the officer the paper right away. That's the thing about dealing with people like Cynthia. If you reveal your hand too early, they regroup, they twist the story, they turn themselves into victims before anybody even realizes what happened. So instead, I just stood there in my driveway while the Tennessee heat rolled off the pavement in waves and said, "Officer, with all due respect, I think you've been dragged into something real stupid." The poor guy looked uncomfortable already. You could tell he'd been expecting some screaming lunatic with a Confederate flag stapled to the garage, not a tired middle-aged electrician holding Folgers in one hand and a screwdriver in the other. Cynthia stepped forward before he could answer. "Mr. Mercer has repeatedly violated community regulations and refused every reasonable request made by the association." She said it like she was reading a hostage statement. "Ma'am," I said, "you filed a police complaint because you don't like my roof." The officer rubbed his forehead. "Sir, she claims you're obstructing access to HOA common areas." And that's when I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly the whole thing clicked into place. Cynthia genuinely believed the neighborhood belonged to her. Not legally maybe, but emotionally. She'd spent so long controlling everybody around her that she'd started confusing authority with ownership. I reached into my back pocket slow enough not to spook Officer Friendly there and handed him the folded county survey map I'd gotten 2 days earlier. He unfolded it carefully while Cynthia kept talking. "This man has continuously undermined neighborhood standards, intimidated residents." And then the officer stopped listening to her. I watched his eyes move across the survey lines, then back to me, then toward the mailbox cluster sitting near the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. "Wait," he said quietly. "This is your land?" "Yep." "The mailbox area too?" "Every inch under the concrete." Cynthia blinked. "That's impossible." I shrugged. "Funny thing about facts, Cynthia. They don't really care how you feel." You should have seen her face. I mean, honestly, if I could frame one moment from this whole nightmare and hang it on my wall, it'd be that expression right there, like somebody had kicked a hornet's nest directly into her soul. The officer handed me the map back slowly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this appears to be a civil dispute." Cynthia snapped around so fast her hair practically whipped the air. "He's lying." "County records don't usually lie," I said. "People do, though." She started spiraling right there in the driveway, talking faster and louder, throwing around words like community jurisdiction and shared use property, but the officer had already mentally checked out. 10 minutes later, he apologized to me, got back in his cruiser, and left Cynthia standing there looking like a woman who'd just realized gravity applied to her too. The second his taillights disappeared, she turned toward me with this cold little smile. "You think this changes anything?" "I think," I said, "you've been trespassing to get your mail for about 3 years." She stepped closer. "People like you always confuse ownership with power." I leaned against my truck. "No, Cynthia. People like you confuse control with respect." She stormed off after that, heels digging into my gravel like she wanted to stab the earth itself. But here's the thing nobody tells you about bullies: once they realize they might actually lose, they get dangerous. Up until then, Cynthia had been annoying. After that driveway conversation, she became obsessed. Within days, she started weaponizing every tiny regulation she could find. Suddenly, county inspectors were driving by my property twice a week. Anonymous complaints got filed about noise violations from my workshop, even though half the neighborhood had hired me to fix outlets and ceiling fans over the years. Somebody reported my shed as an unpermitted secondary structure. Then one night around 11:30, my motion alert camera went off. Now, I'd installed cameras after Cynthia started wandering around my garden, taking photos like she worked for National Geographic, HOA edition. Cheap little security cams from Home Depot, nothing fancy. I opened the footage expecting raccoons or maybe teenagers screwing around near the road. Instead, I saw Cynthia Holloway herself creeping along my property line, wearing yoga pants and carrying a can of spray paint. And this woman, this 50-something self-appointed queen of suburban righteousness, starts painting over the bright orange survey stakes the county surveyor had placed. I just stared at the screen thinking, there is no way this is real life. She looked around every few seconds like a cartoon burglar, then sprayed green paint over every marker she could reach so they'd blend into the grass. The woman was literally trying to erase property lines. I laughed so hard I scared my dog awake. Next morning, I timed things perfectly and caught her at the mailboxes. "Morning, Cynthia," I said. She jumped a little. Russell, sleep okay? Fine. Good. Good. Hey, random question. You know tampering with survey markers is a felony in Tennessee. Her face lost all color. Excuse me. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshot. There she was, crystal clear under the security floodlight, mid-spray like a suburban Banksy, having a nervous breakdown. She stared at the screen for maybe 2 seconds before switching gears completely. You've been recording me? On my property? Yeah. Turns out that's legal too. She grabbed her mail so fast she dropped half of it. You're harassing me now. No, Cynthia. I'm documenting you. That line must have hit something deep because for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely scared. Not angry. Scared. And honestly, part of me almost felt bad. Almost. But then I remembered Maria Alvarez crying because Cynthia threatened liens over wind chimes. I remembered neighborhood kids getting yelled at for drawing chalk on sidewalks. I remembered every fake smile, every passive-aggressive letter, every time she treated human beings like defects in her perfect little kingdom. So no, I didn't feel that bad. A few days later I met with a property attorney named Dana Whitaker downtown. Dana had this sharp-eyed energy like she'd spent 20 years professionally ruining arrogant people's afternoons. I handed her the survey documents, the security footage, and copies of HOA complaints Cynthia had filed against me. She read everything without speaking for almost 15 minutes. Then she leaned back in her chair and said something I'll never forget. Mr. Mercer, your grandfather was either a genius or the pettiest man alive. Little bit of both, probably. She grinned. These parcels she's been harassing you over. She tapped the survey map. They include the retention pond, the playground, the community clubhouse, and according to this easement agreement, she paused. Your HOA's right to use that land expires next year. I blinked. Wait, what? Dana slid the paperwork across the desk. Russell, unless this contract gets renewed, Willow Creek Estates legally loses access to every major community feature they advertise to homeowners. I swear the room went quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then slowly, I started smiling. Because suddenly every nasty letter, every complaint, every fake violation notice Cynthia sent me over the years had transformed into the dumbest long-term strategy I'd ever seen in my life. She'd spent 2 years bullying the one man in town who technically owned half her precious neighborhood. And the craziest part? She still had absolutely no idea how bad things were about to get. The funny thing about power is, most people don't realize how fragile it actually is until somebody finally says no. Cynthia Holloway had spent years acting like Willow Creek Estates was her personal kingdom, and the neighbors honestly had gotten so used to avoiding conflict that they just let her do it. People stopped arguing, stopped pushing back. They'd nod during HOA meetings, pay the fines, repaint their doors whatever approved shade of sadness Cynthia picked that season, because fighting her felt exhausting. And people will tolerate a lot just to keep the peace. But once word started spreading that Cynthia might not actually own the ground she'd been ruling over like a suburban dictator, everything changed. It started quietly. Mrs. Alvarez waved at me again for the first time in months. Then the Hendersons stopped me while I was checking my mailbox and asked if the rumors were true. By the weekend, half the neighborhood had heard some version of the story. And Cynthia? She completely unraveled. She started posting in the neighborhood Facebook group 3 for times a day about external threats to community integrity. She accused unnamed residents of spreading misinformation. One post claimed there were individuals actively attempting to destabilize local property values through intimidation and legal manipulation, which honestly sounded way cooler than anything I was actually doing. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. Now, technically I wasn't allowed inside because I wasn't part of the association, but apparently 50 angry homeowners demanding answers changes the mood real fast. Dana called me that evening laughing so hard she could barely talk. Russell, she said, your HOA president just tried to pass a special assessment charging every homeowner $12,000 for anticipated legal defense costs. I nearly dropped my beer. 12 grand. 3 board members resigned on the spot. Turns out people get a little less loyal once authoritarian nonsense starts hitting their checking account. But Cynthia still wasn't done. See, narcissists have this terrifying ability to keep digging long after they've hit rock bottom. A sane person backs off once reality punches them in the mouth. Cynthia rented an excavator. 2 days later, I got served with a temporary restraining order request claiming I'd been stalking and intimidating her. According to the filing, my security cameras were psychologically threatening. She claimed I'd been watching her movements, orchestrating a harassment campaign, and using legal pressure to emotionally terrorize the community. I sat at my kitchen table reading this nonsense while my dog chewed a tennis ball beside me, and honestly, I started laughing. Not little chuckles either. Full-on exhausted, wheezing laughter. Because when somebody has to completely invent a villain to justify their behavior, it usually means they already know they're losing. Court was Friday morning. Cynthia showed up dressed like she was testifying before Congress, carrying binders and highlighted documents and enough fake emotion to qualify for daytime television. Dana whispered, "Watch this," right before the hearing started. Judge Evelyn Porter looked like the kind of woman who had zero patience for rich, suburban nonsense before lunch. Cynthia launched into this dramatic speech about feeling unsafe in her own community, about aggressive surveillance, intimidation, emotional distress. At one point, she actually called herself a protector of neighborhood values. I almost swallowed my tongue trying not to laugh. Then Dana stood up calmly and handed the judge one folder. Just one. Survey records, security footage, easement contracts, HOA financial reports showing nearly $1 million spent improving facilities built on land they didn't own. Judge Porter spent maybe 4 minutes flipping pages before looking over her glasses at Cynthia. "Mrs. Holloway," she said slowly, "this appears to be a property dispute you attempted to disguise as a harassment claim." The courtroom went dead silent. Petition denied. Cynthia's face collapsed right there in real time. It was honestly hard to watch. Not because I felt sorry for her anymore, that ship sailed months ago, but because you could physically see the moment somebody realizes their illusion of control is gone forever. Outside the courthouse, she caught up to me near the parking lot. No audience this time. No fake HOA smile. Just anger and panic leaking through expensive makeup. "You're destroying this neighborhood," she hissed. I looked at her for a long second before answering. "No, Cynthia. I think I'm just the first person who stopped being afraid of you." She stared at me like she wanted to say something else, but nothing came out. Then she got in her Range Rover and drove away. That should have been the end of it. But life's rarely that clean. The following Saturday, Dana and I hosted a community cookout right there on the open field behind the clubhouse, technically my field, which still makes me laugh every time I say it. We invited everybody. Homeowners, county officials, local reporters, even the maintenance crew guys Cynthia used to scream at over grass height. About 70 people showed up. Kids played basketball. Families brought food. For the first time since Cynthia took over the HOA, the neighborhood actually felt like a neighborhood again instead of a retirement prison with landscaping rules. And right around sunset, while people were eating barbecue and talking under those cheap string lights Jake helped me hang, I stood up near the pavilion and finally told everybody the truth. About my grandfather. About the land deals. About the easement expiring next year. About how close the entire HOA came to losing every major community space because one woman got addicted to control. Nobody even talked for a minute after I finished. Then old Mr. Henderson, Vietnam vet, barely speaks above a mumble most days, raised his beer and said, "Hell of a move, Russell." And just like that, everybody started laughing. Not mean laughter, relief laughter. The kind people let out when tension finally breaks after years of pretending everything's okay. Cynthia resigned 3 days later. Sold her house 2 months after that. Last I heard, she moved to another gated subdivision somewhere outside Nashville, which honestly feels less like a coincidence and more like a warning to whoever lives there now. The new HOA board renegotiated the easement fairly. No more harassment committees. No more weaponized citations. The neighborhood calmed down. Kids started playing outside again. Mrs. Alvarez hung her wind chimes back up. And me? I kept the solar panels. Damn, things work great too. But here's the part one still think about sometimes late at night sitting on my porch. Cynthia wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. Communities do need standards. They need people who care. The problem starts when caring turns into control, when protecting a neighborhood becomes more important than protecting the people living in it. So now I gotta ask you, if somebody like Cynthia moved into your neighborhood tomorrow, how long do you think people would stand up to them before they just gave in to keep the peace? And honestly, would you have fought back the way I did, or would you have let it go? Let me know down in the comments. Because I've learned people have some real strong opinions when it comes to HOAs, property rights, and power trips disguised as community values.